lectures for Gresham College have to be published a year in advance of the event, so that for any lecture that has a contemporary element to it, that's a bit of a risk. And last year, when I said this lecture on Burma and North Korea, I had to guess reasonably accurately that things would have happened between then and now that would make the topic as relevant or more relevant than it was. There's not much law in this lecture, and that's the point. Law should be universal in reach in whatever global or local universe it operates. But international law doesn't operate with universality, and it doesn't treat every atrocity with equal ferocity, and it takes that approach for political reasons. And should this worry the citizen, or should the citizen simply say, there are far too many tragedies in the world, I'm the fortunate one, I'm not in one, I'll get on with my life and forget all about it? Or should he say, we have governments, they can deal with it? Or should he or she say, well, there are NGOs, maybe I'll support one of them? Or should we say that the world of humans should be able to see itself as a family for essentially religious or for entirely practical reasons, and that the suffering through crime of any member of our family is something that I should not permit without doing what I can to reduce it? And in the printed handout, which is a great deal longer than what I'm going to deliver, you'll find my favourite Darwinian quotation as footnote number 1. The citizen's access to ever more information means he has to ask the question, do I have to do more than simply cast my vote or support an NGO? Let's turn straight away to Burma. There you've got a bit of a map so that you know where Burma is, and when we come to it, you know where Korea is in blue up there. Now, we know, don't we, about Aung San Suu Kyi, and maybe a little bit about the massacre of the Buddhist monks. We also know that Burma's become a great holiday resort. But do we know much else? Well, we should do, because Burma's been the scene of the most appalling human rights violations, state-sponsored, many would say, for decades. Since at least the 1990s, there's been forced labour, recruitment of child soldiers, widespread sexual violence, extrajudicial killings, torture. More than 1 million people have been forcibly displaced, 3,000 villages have been destroyed, those with ethnic nationality hostile to the government. But the ruling Burma military junta and its leader, General Than Shwe, have avoided justice, it seems, for decades, and look set to continue to do so. Now, in much of the detail that follows, I am dependent on, or reliant on, and happily reliant on, a report by the Harvard Law School's International and Human Rights Clinic, prepared in 2009, which I reference in the notes, and indeed in which I had some small part. It's a report that you may judge can be relied upon, given the nature of its research, to which I will turn in due course. From there and from other sources, it's necessary to say something about the history of Burma. There's a slightly bigger map of Burma. Until the 19th century, Burma was a collection of territories ruled by different ethnic groups. The Burman people were in the majority, with others surrounding on the edges. Between 1824 and 1885, the British colonized the country by force and then annexed it to India and made it a separate crown colony in 1937. Japan took Burma in the Second World War, and the Japanese-trained Burma Independence Army, led by General Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, initially allied with the Japanese, but as the war went on, many Burmese leaders focused on establishing their own independent state. They created a freedom league. They started to resist the Japanese, now with the British support, and under General Aung San, liberated Burma in 1945. They demanded independence from Britain. They worked together and eventually they got it, but not until the general and several other people had been assassinated. They were assassinated in 47, and independence came in 48. And what's important is that the states were considered autonomous, having certain of those ethnic nationalities had the constitutional right to secede after 10 years. The trust in the arrangements was declining, and during the 1950s, military leaders began criticizing what parliamentary rule was doing to their powers. Overall, and despite having an immense wealth in timber gems, agricultural lands, and a well-educated ruling class, it wasn't doing well enough. Ethnic nationalities began to look for other political solutions, including, on the part of some of them, independence or separation. Numerous groups were formed, and they became in conflict with the Burmese army, the Tatmadaw. So in 1962, General Ne Win, I think I may have got a picture of him, not yet. Oh, that's the wonderful new capital. It comes really later. It's the capital that's been built recently with 20-lane empty highways. Everybody talks about the highway when you go there, but never mind, let's get back to the story. There's the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, and here's General Ne Win, who dominated the country's politics from 1962 until the 80s, ruling with complete control or great control, cutting off support from those other units with other ethnicities that would have sought independence, cutting off food, money, intelligence, and recruits. He suppressed political opposition, and the struggle continued, but they carried on not doing well economically, and a mark of that is that, just by way of example, in 1955, they were exporting 3 million tons of rice a year. By 1988, nothing. We come to 1990 and the popular uprisings that happened then, by which time the currency had devalued, people's savings were wiped out, and there were student demonstrations leading to many people being killed, 3,000 in 1988 alone. The military leadership reorganized itself, took control, declared martial law, and arrested demonstrators. In the aftermath of that, many students fled into the jungle, but despite that, and many of you will now start to remember as opposed to simply having read about the story, despite that, in May 1990, Aung San Suu Kyi was able to stand in elections, and her party, the NLD, was able to get over 80% of the parliamentary seats. So what do? Well, you imprison her. That would seem to be the sensible thing to do, or you put her under house arrest. And that's what they did. And that's where she stayed for most of the next 20 years, 15 of them about, I think. Since that period of time, General Saw Mung, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, who was head for a time, was stood down or was deposed in 1992 by General Than Shwe, who led then the junta. But with the end of the Cold War, and with Aung San Suu Kyi getting the Nobel Prize in absentia, because she was under house arrest, the regime's record began to receive more scrutiny. And there we must slow down a little bit, at least in theory. Oh, there's General Ne Win, yes. In 1991, so that's 2001, 23 years ago, the UN General Assembly passed its first resolution on Burma, followed in 1992 by the UN Commission of Human Rights expressing similar concerns. The Special Rapporteur on the country reported criminality in 1993, documenting various violations, including unlawful custody, torture, cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, and so on. And subsequent years' reports were all pretty much to the same effect. Nevertheless, the independence movements were somewhat weakened. Many of the groups signed ceasefires in the early and mid-90s, but the campaign against them continued with a litany of human rights abuses. Interestingly, the International Labour Organization, a UN agency, had a commission of inquiry focused, of course, on labour. It made some very adverse findings. I forgot to put them up as a slide, sorry. But apart from finding abundant evidence of forced labour and telling a saga of untold misery, suffering, and oppression, this particular 1998 report suggested that there was a systematic use of forced labour that might constitute a crime against humanity. And you'll remember from earlier lectures, if you've been to them, that crime against humanity wasn't yet really fully in play. Not until a few more years was it to be regularly indicted in the recent family of international courts. So that you're getting early and recurring accounts of really serious criminal wrongdoing by the state. Nothing's done, no legal action, nothing, apart from these reports going to the United Nations. Aung San Suu Kyi was constantly under, in and out, but mostly under detention. Universities were closed. Targets included Buddhist monks in 2007, and that led to the Saffron Revolution. The regime ignored all UN Security Council warnings that it should protect political freedoms. Now then, that then brings me to what were the crimes for which there was evidence in that period. Well, I might be able to describe them. I might even be able to find some photographs of them. But probably the better thing to do is to do what the Harvard report did, which was simply to look at and to analyze what the UN had presented to it on a plate. And it was able to explain and to turn to the originating material that the special rapporteur had reported gross human rights violations between 1993 and 2008 in every year of forced displacement, sexual violence, extrajudicial killing, torture, arbitrary detentions. One or two categories missing in 1 or 2 years. The Commission on Human Rights, exactly the same. General Assembly resolutions, exactly the same. How can we live in a world where so much reporting of so much crime can be so easily overlooked? There will be some who say they weren't crime, but at least it ought to be considered. And with the amount of reporting, much of it, you may think, must be accurate. Because the reporting to the UN disclosed offences that would have been contrary to the statute that created the International Criminal Court in respect of murder, enslavement, deportation, torture, imprisonment, rape, sexual slavery. All of these were covered. Persecution, enforced disappearance, and as war crimes, violence to life, outrages against personal dignity, targeting civilians, all sorts of crimes were revealed at the prima facie level. And the Commission, and I have to declare an interest, for I was one of the commissioners who endorsed the report, the Commission made various strong recommendations, observed that the world had done very little in respect of all these findings that were made, and went on to say that based on the findings and recommendations, the United Nations Security Council was called on urgently to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate and report on crimes against humanity and war crimes in Burma. We observed that the court cannot wait with the military while the military regime continues its atrocities. What happened next? Commission of inquiry? No. Commissions of inquiry are slightly dangerous, because once you've got one and it makes recommendations, well, somebody has to do something about it. And that's never entirely convenient. What did the lawyers do? Well, there wasn't really very much they could do. So you can have huge and massive crimes being committed, or evidence about it, and do nothing. But let there be no doubt, there were thousands and thousands of victims. Some dead, and he's still alive. What happened next? Well, now, Burma Campaign UK, a focused, responsible, reliable NGO, prepares monthly reports on Burma. And they make a very good read because you can see how things ebb and flow in the time since. And they reported thousands of refugees going to China, thousands of people being internally dispersed, houses being burned, General Assembly condemnation, and then 400-odd MPs from around the world calling for a proper inquiry into this. The British government announcing that it would support the United Nations referring the case to the ICC. More countries signing up to the idea of a commission of inquiry, Australia being the first, I think. Aung San Suu Kyi was, of course, released, but there were still other political prisoners who were not, many of them, and all proposals by the UN to Burma were basically rejected. Ceasefires were broken, people died, attacks continued in several of the states, villagers fled, and so on. From other reliable sources, the violence between Muslims and Buddhists, and you'll be hearing about that in the last few weeks with the Rakhine story and the census story, which you might have time to deal with at the end. Rape of the Muslim women, Bangladesh closing its door to them, and the Muslims being at sea in boats. So all of this stuff was emerging, all this material was emerging, as you can see from this NGO's reports, and I refer you to it in the notes. But what else was happening? Well, the far-reaching economic reforms with changes to investment laws were attracting Western businesses. There was a tentative distancing between Burma and China. You'll remember, some of you, the dam project that was abandoned. A partially elected parliament where 25% of the seats were retained for the military or guaranteed for the military was established. And Aung San Suu Kyi took up position within parliament and indeed within government. And the Western countries started to change their position. They started less to condemn the human rights and more to court the government, to encourage investment. Now, it's true that Aung San Suu Kyi had probably never specifically approved the idea of a commission of inquiry. That had been done on her behalf by diaspora and activists and NGOs and things like that. But she was now becoming, and has become, much more on side with the government. Indeed, in October 1983 on the BBC, she found herself facing questions it was very difficult for her to deal with about the Muslims. And one of the reasons is that the interest groups in Burma are such that if she comes out strongly in favour of the Muslims, she'll lose all chances of becoming president, probably. So, is that the way the world turns? Is that the way the world must be? And I was talking to one of the members of the NGO yesterday, I think, or the day before. No, yesterday. And the reality which I experienced a little bit myself is that those government officials who you saw 5 years ago, and they welcome you with big, we're so pleased to see you, we agree, human rights are top of the agenda, we must have a commission of inquiry. Yes, please. We're so glad you're doing this work. You go and see them now and their eyes glaze over and they look at you with condescension, wondering how you could be raising such matters when it's after all important to be able to fly to your holiday destination. You don't want to have it disrupted by thoughts that terrible things have been happening and haven't been accounted for, or do you? We will never know how much things would have been different if the international community had stood firm. And to whatever extent it had said, yes, progress and peace can trump justice, if it had also said, but there is no way that we will not require such suffering as may be proved to be recorded, whether the subject of criminal process or otherwise being another issue. Let's move, and there's a reason for twinning these two countries. We'll come to it at the end. there's General Than Shui, there's the report, by the way, of the Harvard Clinic. There's North Korea, with the line across it at the 38th parallel. Now, we probably all know enough about North Korea to know it's a rather strange place, where its citizens suffer violations of human rights that are almost impossible to comprehend. It's a single-party state dominated by a family dynasty, controlling the country through ideological tenets loosely connected to Marxist-Leninist theory. The Korean Peninsula is an ancient civilization, far older than ours, inhabited since Neolithic times, centuries of battles. I suppose looking at it now, you're like tempted as a peninsula, you're tempted to think of Crimea, not that it's in the same place or the same size, but it's a peninsula, so it was always being attacked by people from and on all sides, China, Japan, Mongolia. And over the pre-modern history period, Korea, as a single entity, established a class-based system known as, I think the pronunciation is yangbang, where a small aristocratic elite ruled everybody else. Theoretically meritocratic, it was nothing of the sort. And yangbang was based in some significant way on Confucius and his theories of strict hierarchies leading to social harmony. Japan, following a complex series of conflicts, Japan eventually, in the late 19th century, when the United States had recognized Korea as a protectorate of Japan, in 1910 declared it a colony. Pretty horrible colonization it was. They weren't allowed to speak their own language, the Koreans. It's an entirely different language, an entirely different alphabet. They were moved around to suit the industrial needs of Japan. Japanese people were given all the plum jobs in Korea. And indeed, by 1945, at the end of the Second World War, a very large number of Koreans had been displaced, many millions, outside Korea and China, and hundreds of thousands in the Soviet Union. But as the Second World War was approaching and it was realized who was going to win and who was going to lose, a decision had to be made about Korea. Various possibilities were tried and considered, but the Americans decided, you can just about see it there just north of Seoul, the 38th parallel would be the dividing line. The Soviet Union were to have the top bit, as it were, and the Americans the bottom bit. And when the Soviets arrived with some repatriating Koreans, well, there's a better picture of Korea, they had amongst their numbers a guerrilla fighter, Kim Il-sung. And it wasn't long before Kim Il-sung was effectively, I think, made the leader of the North Korean entity that came into being with the support of the communists. And he did everything he properly could, and probably some of the things he improperly could, to make sure that he was an absolute leader. He was, after all, only a Russian army captain, and so he probably needed and got a certain amount of very high-flown propaganda to encourage the people to believe him, bearing in mind the history, the Confucius system, the system that believes in hierarchy, that believes in the sanctity of certain relationships, including monarch and subject. When he finally established himself, and when he got a guarantee of support from both Stalin and Mao Zedong, and despite the fact that they will argue otherwise, they being the North Koreans, he mounted the attack on South Korea in order to take over the whole of the Korean peninsula. And it is worthwhile just pausing for a minute to think about that war, which we probably don't want to think about. A war fought over ideological differences by strangers on the turf of Korea, which was destroyed. North Korea, in the course of the Korean War, had more bombs dropped on it than had been deployed in the entire Pacific theatre during World War II. The lands on both sides were devastated. The North Koreans succeeded and got south of the 38th parallel and took Seoul. The Americans went back. Then I think the Chinese joined in, and following a wonderful, for military terms, overnight march or over days march, drove everything back to the 38th parallel. But that's where it stayed. And of course, as probably many of you will know, if not all of you, there was no peace agreement. There was just an armistice. The countries are still technically at war. And as a result of that history, and that's why it's worth thinking about it, and by the way, if you go to there is a Commission of Inquiry report, I'll come to that in a second. It's long, it's detailed, but if any of you are interested in it, the passage on the history is a very, very helpful document, and it's also very easy to read. And a lot of it's quoted in the handout, as I explained. The United States still has a military presence south of the 38th parallel, and that, I dare say, is a matter of some concern, along with all the other historical and present things that are a matter of concern. But since the Korean War, when there was a time when both North and South had authoritarian governments and neither were doing well, the South has steamed ahead into one of the most successful economies in the world. And for a range of reasons, let's deal with it in terms that you can measure. The average height of the teenager in North Korea is 5 inches shorter than his compatriot in the South. So how did all that come about? Well, before we make reference to that, I ought to say something, but much less than in the printed note, about dynasty. Because you'll probably know that there were 3, Kim Il-sung, and then, after a time, his son, Kim Jong-il. I think he only spoke once in the course of his period of time in office, publicly. I mean, he spoke presumably privately. It was a strange feeling. And if I simply say that between them, father and son, they set up a system, it's called Suryong, which gives absolute power to the leader and has every member of the community believing in the leader and his every word as being the word of God. And if you have in mind that amongst the various mechanisms they employed to keep people under control was literally to have everyone under control, to have everyone's position and personality assessed, so that you have a class-based system and government says where you can live, where you can't live, what job you can do, everything. And of course, if you have a system where a large percentage, a very large percentage, I think it was said to be 20% at one stage of the population, is informing on the rest of the population, the mechanisms for control are not entirely unheard of. And in the footnotes to the notes, you'll find, I've left them in, long though they are, and probably a bit hard to read on the bus on the way back. But if you read some of the outpourings of the ambassadors reporting back to the Republic of East Germany at the time, so reporting that's likely to be candid, you get a very clear impression of how control can take place, probably even to the surprise of the East Germans. However, one of the things that we must turn to in a little bit more detail is that in the course of Kim Jong-il's reign, following the death of his father, it became necessary for him to maintain management of his country by the creation of what is the most famous part of North Korea's appalling criminal conduct, the prison camp system. And there are many prison camps. I think these are a selection. And they are of different levels of severity, I suppose, not the right word. Some of them are total control prisons where you go and you do not come out. And they are huge. They're the size of Los Angeles, 20 by 30 miles, with wire all around it, all electrified, not electrocuted. And in those camps you live, you labour, you barely eat, and you die. And that is going on now. And sometimes you're born. Because selected, normally men and women are made to sleep separately in these huge camps, but selected individuals could be chosen for the privilege, and I think it was only a few days or nights a year, to marry and have children. Presumably you need more slave labour. And the most famous of the escapees from any camps, and the only one, I believe, even now, ever to have escaped from Camp 14, is Shin Dok. Let's see if we can, I think he's the next one on the screen. There he is, Shin Dok. Shin Dok was born in the camp to parents who'd been put together by the guards for this purpose. His book, which was partly serialised on the BBC and is called Escape from Camp 14, it's written by Blaine Hardin, is, I'd like to say, a gripping read. It's a book which will have something fascinating for you, however horrible, on every page. He gave evidence to the commission that I'm going to tell you about in a little bit, and I think the next slides tell us a couple of things about what he told the commission. He's the only person ever known to have successfully escaped a total control zone. He owes his escape to a tragic coincidence. As nightfall approached on the day of his escape, a friend and he were assigned to collect firewood in the vicinity of the perimeter fence. They decided to seize the opportunity to escape. His friend reached the fence first and was electrocuted as he attempted to climb through a hole. Dangling on the wire, the friend's body created a sufficiently insulated breach for Mr. Shin to climb through and run away. Mr. Shin explained the motivation underlying this risky decision. I heard from this new inmate, that's the chap who died, and who'd come in from outside. It's a very rare example of information coming in. I'd heard from the new inmate that the people outside could eat the same food as the guards freely. I could have been electrocuted. I could have been shot. But I just wanted to have one day for which I could eat all the food that the people outside the camp ate. And I've passed over it, but there was in the 1990s a massive lack of food, starvation, millions of people dying, and the decision being made by some, or the opinion being formed by some, that the government actually used starvation both in and outside the prison as a mechanism of the most awful control. And indeed, every witness who spoke at the commission said that they thought all day long, really, about food. Let's learn a little bit more about Mr. Shin. He was 13 years old when he reported a conversation he overheard between his mother and his brother, or probably half-brother, I'm not sure, but maybe, in which they talked about escaping from the camp. As a result, his mother and brother were both executed, and Shin had to watch the public execution of his mother. She was hanged, and his brother, who was shot, along with other inmates. He described the thought processes leading him to denounce his own mother in these terms, and that's in evidence to the commission. I first reported about their plan to escape because I was obliged to report every detail to the guards. That was the rule of the prison's camp, and that's why obviously I thought it was my job to report about their plan to the guard. And at that time, at my age, I was really proud of that. I asked the supervisor to reward me, to give full portion of cooked dried rice to fill my stomach. And I was promised that reward, and that's why I reported their plan. And public executions in and outside prisons, but certainly in prisons, were a commonplace. Well, now, let's move on to another way of looking at these prison camps, and by taking a tiny view of some of the worst things that happened. It's in a sense unfair, but there's a whole range of other things which are similarly bad and for which you'll have to read more broadly. But it's worth just seeing. The picture you see here is also of Shin, not drawn, I think, by him, but by someone else. He was working in the garment factory that was part of the slave labour, and he dropped a sewing machine as he was walking across the ground. So he had the end of his finger cut off in the way that you can see. The people drawing these diagrams show other things. This, by the way, is also Shin. He was interrogated and held over a fire. And you can see not only was he held over a fire so that his back would be burnt, but they've got a sort of rod in his tummy by which they moved him about. And he's got all the scars of this still to show. Here's a drawing, I think, from an inmate of, probably must be another camp, of a massacre, of shooting of innocent people. Here's chasing rats. There was no other form of food. One of the things Shin was able to tell the commission was that people would try and get grains of food, sometimes out of, I suppose, on the ground, sometimes indeed out of the waste material of animals. And you would be searched as a child to see if you had anything in your pocket. As you had elementary schooling until about the age of 10, I think, before you started on slave labour, or labour. And one little girl in his class was the subject of search, and he explains that normally the teachers would let you get away with a few grains of something in your pocket, although they could do what they liked with you. But this teacher did what he liked with the girl, and he killed her. Beat her in front of all the other children. The following day she was dead. Beat her with a stick. There's one of the comparatively regular executions, and everybody has to go and watch them in order to keep you under control. These are some of the torture positions. I can't remember what that one's called. It says it there, doesn't it? It's that's at the pigeon torture, hung from the wall. Here are three methods of torture: the crane on the left, the plane in the middle, and the one on the right is called the motorcycle. There's a picture of them eating rats and snakes, dead bodies on a regular basis, no burial, just left to rot. And this is a rather unpleasant, in fact, not a rather unpleasant, deeply unpleasant picture. One of the awful things about the North Korean problem was that people were occasionally, men and women, escaping to China. If they went to China, China would send them back. If while they'd been in China, they'd formed a relationship with a Chinese man, and they were pregnant, the women, when they came back, they would be forced to have an abortion. And this is one of the ways that is drawn in order to achieve that. This is happening in your world, probably now. I think that's about enough pictures, I don't know. But I thought we'd come to the next in the dynasty, Kim Jong-un. You know him. He's the young chap. He was under 30 when he inherited the full power of his father and his grandfather. He took to it a bit like duck to water. He cleared out people who might be of danger to him and his political power, and you will possibly remember this extraordinary scene, the ultimate indignity for number 2 in the country, his uncle, who he had decided was not a safe person. So from the meeting, guards were sent to take his uncle from that front seat there. This is last December. And he was taken to what is called a trial, and that was the end of him. So the new young leader, although there are some signs of change, and every sign of change has to be welcomed because any death that can be avoided has to be welcomed. but the young son doesn't seem to be that much different from his father or grandfather. Now, with that background and foreground, where do we go? Well, just as in Burma, and frequently with the same people or similar people, people have been trying to get the United Nations to act. Because although this is the hermit kingdom, as it's known, is an isolated place thought to be completely immune from the world, in fact, it's not the case. They do take notice of what is said and what is done. And there's David Alton in the House of Lords, who's been there, I think, 4 times, and sometimes with other people. And he gets there and he tells them things straightforwardly, and they are prepared to listen. It's not entirely without dialogue. So many people have been trying to get a commission of inquiry for North Korea, in the same way as they've been trying to get one for Burma, but had failed. To everyone's surprise, or at least to some people's surprise, a commission of inquiry was created. And the rather good news was that it was presided over by a retired judge called Justice Kirby from Australia. And he had as one of his fellow commissioners a very good woman called Sonja Biseko from Serbia, who's been busy telling the truth to people when they don't want to hear it for several decades. And they had as their third member the special rapporteur, who was extremely knowledgeable, and a great secretariat. And Justice Kirby is no stranger to, nor afraid of, publicity, and he knows how to use it. And so when this was set up, this commission, and this is quite important, he was determined, somewhat contrary to the instinctive reserve of the United Nations, to have the hearings in public to the extent he could. Some witnesses were in private, but many were in public. And he had hearings in Seoul, Tokyo, Washington, and here in London. And the report came out, very well written, and with very strong recommendations, in February of this year. And it was then presented formally to the United Nations in March of this year, and further presented to the public in The Hague a couple of weeks ago, and last Friday week here in Barnard's Inn Hall. And it's online right now if you want to see it, and if you want to have it sent to friends. It's available. So that he realized that you don't just have a good report. You have a good report, but not one that you want to leave on the shelf. You have a good report that has a future life. Because, of course, the fear of everyone, not the fear, the forecast of everyone is that even if you could get the United Nations to recommend further action, even if you could get the United Nations to recommend a referral, which could happen to the International Criminal Court of North Korea, China, or possibly Russia, would step in and say no. But we are hopeful that enough has been done by raising the story, by making it public, and by people like you knowing about it and being able to write to your MPs or whatever, that on this occasion, China may have to stay its hand. And some of the other things happening around the world could possibly help that. Even if it doesn't stay at hands, if it does veto any action that the United Nations tries, the head of steam given by this public preparation of evidence and presentation will enable us, or enable those who are concerned with this, to take the issue further in some other way or ways. So, to some extent then, that is a slightly better news end of the story than we might have feared, because last year when I decided to talk about these two countries, we were pretty certain which way Burma was going, or I was, and it was always going to be possible that there would be the same result for North Korea, but not so. Now, what sort of conclusions may we draw from all this? I think there are several. The Burma government leaders may now, or in due course, be seen to have been clever, and the outside world to have been somewhat naive, that is, the world outside to them. At present, those working within the country, or those who work on the Thailand border and bring in aid and education to the people who don't get those things from the present Burma regime, are appalled at the difference between the situation they see on the ground and the situation that is described in such rosy terms by governments that clearly have an interest, probably a financial interest, in seeing Burma, quotes, succeed at least in commercial terms. One commentator for the region, and I think this is not a unique position, I think I've heard it elsewhere from people who know Burma reasonably well, wonders whether the government leaders there can see that half the world is ruled by dictators and the other democratic half doesn't mind. And what it wants to do, maybe, despite all its apparent engagement with people like David Alton, with democratic process, all it would like to do, really, is to move up one rung from pariah dictatorship to dictatorship. Well, I suppose that's possible. And what we're seeing in Burma at the moment, in the encouragement coming from the UN, after all, they've been asked now, haven't they, to send their troops as peacekeepers, I think, somewhere. We may see a result of some backstage deal. We won't send you to the International Criminal Court if you do this. You never know. We'll never know, as I said earlier, what would have happened if a stronger position had been taken. As to North Korea, in contrast, things are rather different, and probably for two reasons. The regime is arguably, manifestly more black and white, worse, if I can put it in that sort of term. And the citizens have made very limited gains, although they have made some gains, it would appear, from those who visit that part of Korea. And the regime has not yet seen how to play the West and win, and may not do so until it is too late for them, because the rest of the world might by then have stood firm with the Commission of Inquiry report, with whatever following action is made by the United Nations. And when the present regime falls, and it will fall, the only question is if and when, and not if, it's when. When it falls, the successor government may be pleased to give these leaders, or whoever takes over and behaves in the same way, a one-way ticket to a city in the Netherlands. That would be perhaps a happy outcome. There are other lessons, I think, that can be drawn from comparing these two countries and their recent engagement with the international community. And there are many people who are infinitely more knowledgeable about the facts on the ground than me, so I'm only really focusing on the reaction of the international communities to these countries. There are other lessons that can be learned. And one of them, I think, relates to that picturesque encounter I suggested of the NGOs and the activists meeting the government officials and finding that their eyes have changed from whatever warm and friendly colour it is to a rather slaky grey where they show no interest at all. And the short answer, the short point that may emerge from this is that it's not really right any longer to take activists on a take-it-and-leave-it basis. They have an important contribution to make, as we all do, once we know about things, within the family of the world, to ensuring that an individual member should not be suffering if we can do something to avoid it. And so I hope that out of all this and out of other similar events that are going on at the same sort of time, that there may be a greater recognition that what we can all do is more important, and that politicians shouldn't think it's just a game for them to play, brush their hands and move on to something else. And my personal final point again relates to the victims. Yes, you can say, as I suggested earlier, that peace can always trump justice. But there is no way that you can justify saying, look, it suits us to let these people get away with this, and so you and your family will come to the end of your life without your suffering ever having been properly recorded. I wouldn't want that to happen, and I don't think anybody else would. And I do not believe that in making deals, whether it's with Idi Amin, as was done, or with Muammar Gaddafi, as might have been done, with President Assad, as could still be done, making a deal with any of those people does not mean that you have to say to the victims, and part of this deal is that your history will never be told, because by judicial justice mechanism or otherwise, it must be. Before I move to allow you questions, and I'm in good time tonight, the trailer for what is to come. I've told you all about what you can already find on the site about the Roundtable Conference on North Korea. My next lecture is the last of this year, and it's pretty nearly the last one in which I'm going to deal with these unpleasant international topics. I've got one more year to go, and there'll be one lecture there which will cover these issues, as I'll explain. But the last lecture of this series is about head of state immunity. Again, I had to set out in advance by over a year that this might be a topic of interest. And again, I think I was reasonably accurate. Kenyatta, President of Kenya, is or is not going to have to stand trial. And as you look all the way around the world, you'll see lots of cases of people saying, let's try this state or let's try that. But the issue of whether a head of state has or should have immunity from the trial process is in fact not resolved. And it's an extremely important and very interesting issue. And so that's what I shall be turning to in the last lecture. Now next year, the only one on these related topics will come in July, because in July of next year we will be at the 20th anniversary of the massacres in Srebrenica, and it seemed appropriate to try and draw some threads together about that particular massacre and the wider circumstances dealing with it. So that leaves me with 5. I think one of them ought to be a funny one, or light-hearted-ish, so that leaves me with 4. I have it in mind to give 2 on the subject that if any of you did read the newspaper, I'm sure would have you excited, that is human rights. And I won't mention what the newspaper is in case you can't guess, but there are readers of certain newspapers who, when they see the word human rights, get terribly excited. And I shall hope to defuse that excitement by looking at human rights both in a historical and philosophical context. Are the special rights that exist? Are they not? And something about them. So that there will leave 2. Now, at the beginning of this, or at the end of last season, I invited you, if you wanted to make suggestions as to what, if anything, you'd like to hear dealt with. And they don't have to be a lecture. We can turn it into a discussion. We can do all sorts of things. Because law as a topic is not necessarily that easy to make exciting for non-lawyers, or lawyers, come to that. And so, but we go to print, as Valerie will tell you. Sorry?
June, but I would need to know before.
June-ish. So if you do have any ideas, please tell me, or please tell the staff, because it's always helpful to know what would interest you and what I can tell you about, if I can, that's of value. Right, we've now done the trailer and for this year and next. Questions, comments, or contributions? My goodness! I've never seen 4 hands shoot up so quickly. Right, we see who the other 3 are. Philip, you go first, and please make all contributions short. We've only got 6 minutes. Thank you all very much.